Welcome back to the Shepherd's Pie, a slice of hope to raise faithful kids. I'm Tony Kolenc, a law professor, columnist for Homeschooling Magazine, and author of the Harwood Mysteries YA novels. A bit of news on that, by the way. Book 4, The Merchant's Curse, is now out just in time for the spooky Halloween season and early Christmas shopping. So check it out on my website or on Amazon. On today's show, we're going to be discussing a very difficult topic, and that is, how do we deal with scandal within Christ's own church? And more to the point, how can we speak about such a scandalous topic to our children and our students, or should we even speak about it to them? And my guest is Ellen Gable, who's written a Catholic novel on that very issue based on some very personal true events, but in a way that glorifies God and keeps the faith. Today, my guest is Ellen Gable. She's the founder of Full Quiver Publishing, and she's also an award-winning author of 12 books. She's an editor, a speaker. She teaches natural family planning and theology of the body and marriage preparation. But as she puts it, the roles that she loves the most are being a wife to her husband of 40 years, James, and the mother to their 5 adult sons, and a grandma to 2 precious grandchildren. Ellen, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Tony.
And of course, I know you through the Catholic Writers Guild. I talk about you from time to time on the show because I'm always in awe of how you took not only your writing, but brought it into the publishing business and started your own publishing house, which is just incredible. So maybe just talk a few minutes about your own background and how did you get into writing and publishing?
Well, I've always loved writing, but I got married and had 5 children and didn't really have a lot of time to write. But I had found out years ago, like 22 years ago, that my great-grandmother was kind of part of the early Planned Parenthood movement in the early 1900s and had abortions, and it really bothered me. So I was spending time in front of the Blessed Sacrament trying to get peace about it, and I had what could only be described as a supernatural experience, and came home and I told my husband, and he said, well, you should probably write a book and base it on your grandmother's story and your story. So that's what I did. And I thought, how hard could this book writing be? And of course, it was very hard. It took 4 years for that book because I still had small children. But basically, once it was finished, I soon found out that there were very few Catholic publishers taking on fiction. So my husband and I just made the decision to start our own publishing company, not even thinking long term that we would be publishing other people's books, but just to publish this book. Once we published that book, I wanted to write more books, but not base them on true stories. And so I wrote some more books and we published those. And then, it started getting really profitable. We decided to take on other authors at that stage, authors who were writing theology of the body fiction. That's basically how we began, and here we are 20 years later.
And just for those who might not be fully immersed, what is theology of the body or theology of the body fiction?
Well, theology of the body, as St. John Paul II said, is the study of God through our bodies. It's really a fascinating thing, and it's a massive resource. There are all kinds of books on theology of the body, but basically every book that we publish, the human person is seen as an irreplaceable, unrepeatable image of God. That's really the basic kind of definition for what we call theology of the body fiction.
It's actually a good segue to our topic today, because your latest book that you've put out through Full Quiver is called Where Angels Pass. So you've made public in this book something very awful that happened to your father as a young teenager. Why did you decide to share this personal and difficult story?
It was time, because with the first scandal in the early 2000s and then the scandal with the former cardinal, it was like pulling a scab off of a wound for me, because so many people were saying so many bad things about the church. And really, it's not the church that abused my father. It was a particular person within the church. And I saw all these people writing books, and they didn't experience sexual abuse by a priest. They weren't part of a family. had a family member experience abuse, and they were all saying, we need to leave, you need to leave the church. And my father never left the church despite what he went through. And I have never left the church, and I don't plan to leave the church because of something bad that happened to him. So I really wanted to write a story that showed and illustrated a victim and his family who remained Catholic.
How closely does the story actually toe to the real events you and your father experienced?
It's a parallel story between my father and myself. A lot of what I wrote from Evie, who is my character, most of that is true, especially conversations I had with my father. The part at the end where she meets a certain person, and that was made up because by the time I was ready to forgive, that person had passed away. It goes very, very closely to the real events.
All right. And then again, for those who wouldn't have read the book, what is the basic premise? What's the storyline of the book, if you will?
So the basic premise of the book is it begins with my father as a 14-year-old boy starting high school. And so he puts his trust in one of his teachers, and one of his teachers abuses him, and it just sets him on a spiral. He doesn't understand what has happened. He doesn't know if he could even tell anybody. And of course, he decides not to tell anybody, and it just eats away at him. And the parallel story is for Evie, it starts off with her father's sudden death. Many of these abuse victims have to deal with mental illness, which my father had a nervous breakdown when I was 2 years old, and also drugs and alcohol. Also problems for my father. And unfortunately, it was an accident, but unfortunately, he wound up dying from a combination of alcohol and drugs and OD by mistake. But I was a teenager at the time, and of course, you're a teenager. You just think everything's going to be perfect in your life, at least up till that point. I knew my father was an alcoholic, but he was trying hard to stay on the wagon, and I knew he had had issues, but I loved him, and he was a wonderful father. And it was a very difficult thing to have to lose your father, especially if you've had a close relationship with him as a young child and a young teen. And basically, it's taken about 43 years for me to be able to sit and write the story without bawling. That's basically what it's about.
All right. So some people, I'm sure, would be asking themselves, it's such a scandalous topic. It's such a difficult topic. How do you even talk about this with kids? Should we even bring this up, with our kids or our students, if we're in a youth group or a Christian or Catholic school? Should this even be a topic of conversation, or should we kind of ignore it?
Well, if a question is asked, it should be answered, in my opinion, and it should be answered honestly to the however mature the young person is. I know that when my brother, I think he was my youngest brother, would have been in high school, one of his friends, a priest, tried something with one of his friends, and actually the friend punched the priest. so, and we talked about it as a family. Now, it was after my father died, but I was a teenager at that point and very naive. So it was really good for me to hear that from my mother and my brother telling me about that story, because, they were saying this is a person within the church. This is not the church, right? This is a person who clearly has a lot of issues. And so I think we should be honest to the young person's maturity. I don't think we should just, we're sitting there with our 12-year-old and we just say, hey, by the way, have you heard about the church's scandal? Well, no, I don't think we should do that. But I think we should be honest with any young person that asks questions.
And I guess what I wonder is, would a young person, especially like in a youth group or Catholic school setting, such an awkward topic that they wouldn't even want to talk about it? I don't know if you have any experience or have seen
We
that.
do. We do, actually. My husband and I taught grade 9 classes, freshman classes at a local Catholic high school for almost 5 years. And it did come up. And it came up because some of the students were trying to prove that the Catholic Church must be bad because it let this happen. And we reiterated yes, there are people in the church. The church is run by, human beings, and we are all sinners. And there are some sinners who really don't repent and they try to remain in the church. And so, there is no reason to leave the church because of what fallible human beings do.
I'd imagine that's got to be the toughest question in my mind from a kid is it's not just any human being in the church, it's the priest. This is somebody who's supposed to have this amazing special relationship with God. And, in the Catholic Church, this is the one who's consecrating the body and blood and soul and divinity of Jesus. And here he is at the same time engaged in what probably most of us would think is one of the most, if not the most heinous thing you can do to another human being.
Correct.
How do you answer that question? I'm sure that has to have come up also.
We've gotten that question before, and the answer is, again, there are some priests out there who do not want to live as priests and who obviously don't care about church teaching or about their own souls even because they want to endanger other souls. We also point out all the wonderful priests that we do know that are trying their hardest and that are very courageous in their living out of the priestly vow. And so it's really on a person by person basis, because even when you're talking about abusers, it's very likely that many of those priests probably were abused as children. And, there before the grace of God go I. The whole idea of what to do with these priests, which back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if anything was done, it was to move them from parish to parish, which of course was disastrous. And really, I think the higher ups were probably trying to prevent scandal, but at the same time were causing the scandal, right? So that kind of makes it difficult. But nowadays, there are treatments and things like that. And I've actually watched some YouTube videos in trying to prepare for this. I knew my own story and my father's story, but I wanted to hear from other victims. And there were actually priests who were not abusers, but priests who were victims, and they became priests. So yeah, it is a difficult topic, but every human being is made in the image and likeness of God, and sinner or saint. And of course, we're all trying to be saints, but we all fall short. We all have this intrinsic goodness in us that we're in God's image. And it's so unfortunate that, these priests have really tarnished the image of priests and of other clergy. It wasn't just priests, actually. In my research, there were sisters, religious sisters, who were also very abusive. I had one or two that were physically abusive, never to me per se, but we're all beautiful creations of God, but we all fall short at some point.
Yeah, and you point out that, again, the priests themselves may have been victimized. I believe that if nothing else, there could be mental illness causing that type of behavior. But still, you've got the multiplication of the scandal and the evil.
Right.
So you talked about it in the context of ninth graders who are old enough. And of course, nowadays, kids have seen everything that there is to see anyway by the ninth grade. And so talking about this topic might not be as sensitive, especially if they're in a public school. But what about little kids? I don't know if little kids in elementary school or middle school, I'm sure they're seeing it now. Is there a way to broach this kind of a topic even with younger kids?
I would say just be sensitive to the child's maturity. In that vein, we brought up 5 sons. We raised 5 sons, and they were all very different. And one of our sons was particularly sensitive. And when The Passion of the Christ came out, he would have been maybe 14 at the time, and he just didn't think he could handle it, right? And so I think we need to be aware of whoever we're talking to, whether it's a 4-year-old, 5-year-old, use language that they would understand and not there doesn't need to be a lot of detail. It could just be this one person did a bad thing to this other person, and, that sort of thing. And again, it might not need to be brought up unless, of course, a sibling or, somebody that they know has experienced it.
Now, knowing you and knowing Full Quiver, you're not the kind of author who's going to write a graphic novel about this type of a topic. I'm assuming
Correct.
you yourself, in addressing this, even though it's the pivotal plot of the story, had to find a way to talk about it in a way that would be acceptable to a Catholic audience. How did you handle that as an author?
Well, it's kind of like you see in some books where you know that the woman and man are going to consummate their marriage, but nothing is shown. Well, it's the same sort of thing. He's in the middle of it and he freezes, and then it kind of fades. So we know what he's done, but we don't have really any of the deep details. And we don't need that. I don't think you need details or language or any of that sort of thing to get the story across.
And then you mentioned earlier the theme of forgiveness and how that's so important in your story. Can you talk a little bit about forgiveness and how you handled it, not only in your own life, but in the story?
Well, I can tell you in real life and in the story, because I wrote this very similar to the way it happened. When I found out, my first thought was, I hope that priest is burning in hell. Now, that's not a very Christian thought to have. And really, it was coming from a place of anger, of disgust, of sadness, because my father's whole life was changed by this one incident. He had troubles his whole life. I would call it a tumultuous life. And so, obviously, anger, one of the first stages of grief. So, from anger, then, of course, I had a conversation with my spiritual director, and he said, your anger is righteous. You should be angry, but you still need to be on the road to forgiveness. We are called to forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So we are called to forgive no matter how heinous the crime or the offense. And so after that, I just prayed that I could forgive, because I certainly wasn't feeling it. I wasn't feeling the forgiveness. And my spiritual director told me, you don't have to feel the forgiveness. You just have to be on the road to forgiveness and trying your best to forgive. It's a process. It's not going to be overnight. And that was true. The other thing as well with forgiveness is that I decided that I would start not only praying for this priest's soul, but also that I would start fasting for him. And, in the beginning, it's like, I don't really want to fast for him, but I will anyway. And really, it does come to a point where, yes, I think I've forgiven because I'm at peace in my soul. And whenever I hear something come up on the news about the clergy abuse scandal or more priests abusing more children or whatever, I don't kind of tense anymore. I don't get rigid, or I just let the news come and say, okay, I've forgiven. And really, the forgiveness isn't necessarily for the priest, although it is for him. It's for my peace, because I think it would have tore me up on the inside had I held on to that anger and that rage.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier too that the anger needs to be directed at the right person, which would be the priest, not necessarily the church at large. But I'm wondering, and I'm sure you get this question from teenagers, they say the cover up is worse than the crime sometimes. Is there a sin of the church in the leaders of the church who were covering some of these things up to avoid scandal or for whatever other reason? And is that something that teenagers need to be thinking about? Oh, maybe I need to forgive the church. Is that the right way to think about that?
Yes, I do think we need to forgive certain leaders of the church who allowed it, who knew what was going on and allowed it. The church is run by fallible human beings, and even in the leadership, all the bishops and all the cardinals, there are many sinners among them, and some maybe not so repentant. And so, yeah, there is a certain faction of us that should forgive the church, but more so the people involved and the human beings involved. And one thing I wanted to say about forgiveness doesn't mean that I don't want justice. I would imagine if my father's abuser was repentant, that he would have seen God's justice through a long stay in purgatory, I'm sure. And it doesn't mean that you forget about it. You can still remember it, but it means that you have peace.
So just kind of wrapping up this part of the interview, if you had a piece of advice, you have a parent or a teacher who is concerned, what do I do if somebody brings this up in my class? Or what do I do if my kid comes home from school and asks me this after church or whatever? Do you have any, just kind of a nice piece of advice for them in broaching this topic or dealing with this topic?
Yeah, I would say it's important to be honest, but keep in mind the innocence of whatever age child brings it up. You could be honest, but be very vague. And it depends on what questions they ask and that sort of thing. We made it a rule in our house to be as honest as we could be with our kids to their maturity. We didn't want to destroy innocence or anything by being too graphic about things. And I would also say a prayer to St. Charles Lumanga and St. Josephine Bakita before you start talking, because they are two Catholic saints who were sexually abused and became saints. So they will certainly pray for you to have the right words.
And I guess actually I did want to ask one other question, because I think a teenager would think like this. And you said earlier you didn't leave the church. You weren't going to leave the church because this happened. But I think somebody might wonder why. Like a teenager might say, well, why shouldn't I leave the church? I should go somewhere else where this hasn't happened, or where people are not such big hypocrites or something.
Well, the answer is that I remain in the church because of the Eucharist, because Jesus Christ is the head of the church, and this is the church he founded, and it is the true church, despite the mistakes and sins of many of its priests, many of her priests. And as I said, my father wasn't the best practicing Catholic. He didn't go to Mass every single Sunday, but he never left his faith. And he always said his rosary. And I really admired that in him, because despite all the bad times, despite all of the difficult times, he still said his rosary and he still tried to get to Mass when he could. And he and my mom did their best to bring us up Catholic.
All right. So this is about the time that I do the entertainment segment. And I asked Ellen if we can actually talk about one of her books for youth. All right. So in the entertainment segment, Ellen Gable also writes books for teens, and some of those books are on CatholicTeenBooks.com, a website I talk about often because it's a place where many authors, including Ellen and myself, have their work available for families. So Ellen, could you tell us about your latest book that actually is geared for a teenage audience?
Well, that would be Ella's Promise, which is part of the Great War, Great Love series. And basically it is about an American nurse who goes over to Europe to tend to the wounded for the Allies. And she is from a German background. Her parents were German immigrants. So when she goes over and she is treating patients, she treats them as human beings with respect and with dignity. Every soldier who is ill is treated to her best, because she believes that is what she is called to do, to bring love and to bring care to all soldiers, regardless of which side they're on.
What age range would you say this book is best for?
I would say 12 and up. It does take place in World War I. There's not a lot of graphic violence, and it's nothing like adult books. But it is a war, and it does have a romance with a Canadian spy, basically. She makes a promise to herself that she's going to go to medical school back in the day when not very many women went to medical school. But also, the title refers to a promise that she saves an enemy officer. And he says, if you ever need anything, I promise I will help you. And she actually depends on that promise.
If our listeners wanted to get a hold either of Ella's Promise or Where Angels Pass or any of your other work, where would you like them to go?
They can go to Amazon. If they want to read more about my different books, they can go to fullquiverpublishing.com. And of course, all of our authors' books are on there and they can just browse. But all of my books are on Amazon, and that's probably the best place to get them.
All right, Ellen, thank you so much for joining us today on such a tough topic. I love the beautiful way that you've approached it. And as somebody who had to live it, you obviously come with a huge amount of credibility on this topic. So thank you for sharing the story with us today and for the charitable way that you really approach it.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, Tony.
So we've been speaking with Ellen Gable about how to speak with youth about scandal in the church. Again, this is Antony Barone Kolenc. If you have a question for me or a topic you'd like me to cover on the show, please drop me a line on my website at antonykolenc.com. And you can also learn more about my historical fiction series on my website, The Hardwood Mysteries. Until next time, may God bless you and your families as we work together to raise faithful kids.